Well, good evening everyone. I'd like to welcome you to the University of Melbourne's Water Security Series, next instalment, Implications for Water Storage. My name's Sharon Davis. I'm an Enterprise Senior Fellow with the Water, Environment and Ag program at the university, and I will be your MC for this evening. Running with the theme of technology, we're also going to be using some technology as part of today's discussion. So our panel at the end of the session will be answering some audience questions, and we'll be encouraging the audience to participate using an app called Slido. So to submit your questions, if you go to www.slido.com, which is up on the screen now, and enter the event code, which is #WaterSecurity19, and then type your questions, then that will feed those questions through to an iPad, and I will endeavour to answer have as many of your questions answered by our wonderful panel. So we'll be being a bit technologically innovative using that method. If you would like to join the conversation on Twitter, the hashtag for discussion is also #WaterSecurity19. So many different ways to engage technologically this evening. Before I introduce tonight's event though, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, on which the event is taking place, the land of the Wurundjeri people, and I pay my respects to the elders past and present. So the event this evening is part of a series discussing important issues surrounding water security, where we aim to bring together thought leaders from academia, industry and government to provide evidence-based insights and raise the quality of debate around key issues. Tonight we're focusing on key approaches and implications in maintaining water security through Melbourne's various water supply systems. And I'm really thrilled that we have an excellent panel with us tonight to talk through those issues. Our panellists sitting here are Professor Andrew Weston, Professor John Thwaites, Richard Smith and Alida Donald. So we'll have a great series of both presentations and also a panel discussion to follow. To start with, our first speaker is Professor Andrew Weston. And just to introduce Andrew, he's a professor with the University of Melbourne, and his teaching and research projects explore the confronting but important question of how much water is really available to us. Welcome, Andrew.
Thanks, Sharon. I'm going to talk tonight about some work we did with Melbourne Water, with Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning, and with the three retailers, Yarra Valley Water, City West Water and South East Water. And that work was really looking at the value of water in storage, and in particular how the amount of water you have in storage interacts with the likelihood that you might have to further augment the water supply system, and that is really where a lot of the value of that water in storage comes from, around cost savings and risk reduction around augmentation, etc. So we started out with key contention that the system operation strongly affects the likelihood of augmentation and therefore the long-term costs of supplying water. And the aim was to estimate the cost of maintaining volumetric supply reliability and account for both short and long-term costs in doing that. So we were trying to bring together both the economic side of those costs, but also bring that together strongly with the hydrologic variability, hydrologic risk that might be in the system as well. So what we really developed was a framework for valuing water. It was an analysis of the costs of assuring water supply reliability, particularly applied to Melbourne. And in doing that, we explored a range of different operational scenarios, and that's what I'm going to take you through tonight. So when faced with a water supply crisis, urban systems will typically be augmented, especially in larger cities where you can't perhaps bring an alternative solution to the problem, such as trucking in water. If you're on the coast, those augmentations nowadays often revert to things like desalination and other climate-independent sources of water. Essentially, that allows you to buy water in times of shortage. In doing the work, we made a number of key assumptions. First of all, we assumed that there was some sort of either implicit or explicit tolerable risk that was acceptable in the system, and that if the risk in the system exceeded that, then that would trigger an augmentation. That augmentation would involve some sort of climate-independent source of water, such as desalination, and we could implement that with a known lead time. We knew the costs of both doing the augmentation, but also a whole lot of other costs around operating the system, the social costs around restrictions, etc. And we also were taking the perspective that we're sitting here making that decision today, so we actually know what the current status of the system is. And of course, the risk of running short of water in the short term is strongly influenced by that current storage. So if you take all of the above, you can work out a cost of maintaining reliability from a starting point in storage. So we built a model that simulated the Melbourne system. It's essentially a simplification of the realm type models of the system. Once we built it, we compared it to realm. It's a model that allowed us to do a lot of stochastic replicates to look at risk and those sort of issues. It was a model that concentrated on the main sources of supply and storage in the system, rather than on the detail of the operation within Melbourne. So it didn't look really at the distribution system. We just divided demand into three main zones, and we simulated the major storages. You'll notice that Sylvan is represented up there, not looking like a dam, so Sylvan really acts pretty much as a balancing storage in the system, so we didn't look at that from a supply reliability perspective. And the same thing with Greenvale. So if you know the details of the system, you might think there's a couple of storages missing there. And of course, the Wonthaggi desalination plant, Victorian desalination plants included. And the augmentations, the potential augmentations that we looked at in the system were expanding that plant. So the plant was originally designed and constructed with the ability to expand it from the current 150 gigalitre capacity up to 225. And we also, the second and third augmentations of the system were a desalination plant probably to the west of Melbourne with an initial capacity of 50 gigalitres a year, and then an expansion again of that of 50 gigalitres a year. And there's different costs associated with all those augmentations because of the different infrastructure involved, etc. And I should also note that transfers through the north-south pipeline are included here, and the economic analysis included some modelling of water prices in the market in Northern Victoria, and included both opportunity costs of utilising that water in Melbourne and the various treatment and transfer costs associated with that. So that's one of the supply options that we looked at, or that is in the current system, but at the moment only operated under really low storage conditions. We dealt with restrictions that pretty much match the current restriction scenario. And we had various water savings and social costs that depended on the stage of those restrictions, and we included additional costs for the situation where you couldn't meet stage 4 restricted demand, and so there would likely be a pretty significant social cost around that. Desalination, so I'm starting to go through a base case comparator. So the desalination operation we assumed was that at 65% storage, and at the 1st of January there'd be a 50 gigalitre a year order. As storage came down at 1st of January trigger points, by the time you got down to 60%, you were operating the desalination plant at capacity, and the operating costs of that depend on the order size. North-South pipeline has a capacity of around 75 gigalitres a year transfer, and operates if the storages are less than 30%. And as I said before, we included both the operational and the opportunity costs associated with water from the Goulburn. We simulated a series of augmentations which occurred when storage levels fell below trigger points in the system. We essentially assumed that we wanted to keep system storage above 40%, and that implied an augmentation trigger would occur at some storage above that, which was related to both the lead time that augmentation would take to deliver, so 3.5 years in the base case for expanding Wonthaggi, and depending on the lead time, we also assumed some minimum inflows which matched what had been historically minimal water harvesting over different lengths of time. So if you put all that together, put it into a water balance scenario, and you run stochastic replicates of inflows, and they matched, or what I'm presenting here, matched the conditions that we've seen essentially in the last 20 years. You get a whole lot of simulations. Sometimes the system will be full, sometimes it'll run really low, etc. Those simulations all start from a starting storage in year 0 here, so the system might start full or at 80% right down to 20%. From each of those starting points, you've obviously got a lot of variability, and what you're looking at here is the average storage conditions. So you can see the Melbourne system actually has about 10 or so years memory in it. You can also see that under the medium demand scenarios that are assumed here, and the climate like the last 20 years, that we converge to storages around about 1,400 gigalitres on average out into the future. But some of those scenarios, or some of those individual replicates or simulations involve an augmentation, and that involves a significant cost, as well as all the operation, etc. So the cost components are shown here, and I'll show you a variety of graphs that look like this. So on the bottom axis here, the x-axis, you've got the starting storage at the start of the simulation. So if we looked at this year, we would be starting around 60% here, as in that was around about the storage on the 1st of January. So, and from that sort of storage, we have some costs that we expect from restrictions in the light blue here. So this is social cost of not supplying a full demand of water. We have some desalination operation that occurs. We have some capital costs associated with expanding the system or augmenting the system. And they're really the three main costs that contribute to the overall costs, but included in there are some other things like operational costs on, say, the North-South pipeline, which is only operated in really low storage conditions. So you can see that just down here, and some other relatively small costs. The reason there's a big step up here is that's around about where the the first augmentation, so the expansion of the Victorian desalination plant occurs once you drop below a storage of about 50%. There, you'll notice in the capital costs here that there is capital costs associated even for storage starting at 100%, and that's because over the 20 years you get some replicates or some scenarios where the water level, storage levels drop far enough to have an augmentation, and the closer you are to 100% storage, the fewer of those augmentations there are, so the less the capital cost. And you'll also notice down at quite low storage levels, so if you start, say, at 40%, you automatically got the first augmentation occurring because it's below the trigger level, but you've still got an increase in capital cost here because the second augmentation is coming in some of the replicates, and occasionally even the third augmentation. So that's the base model and the base case and how we've gone about adding things up, I guess. We then looked at a variety of scenarios. So if we look at the top three for a start, the base case is the red line through the middle here, and that was desalination orders that were occurring between 65 and 60% storage. We looked at what if you turned the desalination plant on a little earlier, so the small orders made it 75% storage, and then the larger orders back in the 60s. And also, what if you shifted it all down so that you had orders occurring at 55, 52.5 and 50%, which is pretty low storage levels. So what you can see is, if you look at the lowest desalination case here, that's the highest expected cost of maintaining reliability if you operate the system with those operating rules. The base case is in the middle here, and the higher use of desalination, which is really just using small waters in the range between 75% and 62.5% storage, that involves a lower cost of maintaining that reliability. We then looked at a couple of other cases. So what if you, instead of taking 3.5 years to augment that Wonthaggi plant, what if you were really organised and ready to go when conditions required you to make that augmentation, so you could do it in 2 years, super organised? What that actually implies is you can wait a little longer before you do the augmentation, so you can avoid some augmentations, because instead of 3.5 years, you've only got 2 years. So you've essentially got that first 1.5 years when it might rain more. And that allows you to avoid some augmentation. But of course there's an assumption there around how quickly you can deliver those projects. And also, what if we used the North-South pipeline more, which turned out to be quite a low-cost option as well. So if we look at that, for different storages, again, this is at the 1st of January, and so for this year we're really looking at this case, and this is a comparison of the overall cost of maintaining that reliability. So you're looking at a range between a little bit under $300 million in net present value terms, and this is over the 20-year horizon, up to about $670 or so million. So there's some large differences in expected costs here associated with these different scenarios, and really it comes back to whether or not you've had to augment the system over that time period. So the more likely you are to augment the system, the larger these costs are.
I'm sorry, Andrew, just explain to me how using desal less ends up with a higher capital cost. I apologise.
So using desalination less you end up with lower storages, therefore you're more likely to hit that augmentation trigger. So you do more augmentation, so the capital costs are a substantial increase. Of course, you have somewhat lower operating costs, slightly lower operating costs. So there's that trade-off, yeah. But really, the big driver in here is how often you do an augmentation. So if you're an economist, you might like to think of this in marginal cost terms or marginal value terms. So these are the marginal values for water and storage, dollars per kilolitre. And desalination water is sitting in here in the current system, costs about 50 odd to 60 odd cents, depending on the order level. And so if you look at that and say, well, we should match our marginal costs and our marginal value, you'd be saying, well, you'd be ordering desalination around to about 70% storage. If we look at the occurrence of augmentation, and this really explains the differences, I guess, in the costs between the scenarios. So what we're looking at here again is initial storage, and on the y-axis it's the percentage of simulations where the system was augmented. When you start below the augmentation trigger, obviously everything gets augmented. So the real differences are up here, and you can see the substantial difference between not using the desalination plant very much, using it more, and then the other options of either having a shorter lead time or using the desalination, the north-south pipelines some more. So really the argument here is that how you operate the desalination plant or how you operate other parts of the system has a substantial impact on your probability of augmentation. You can buy yourself time to implement a whole lot of other demand management or alternate water supplies, etc. A whole lot of other ways of addressing water security if you've got that buffer in storage. This is actually the proportion of those simulations where we ended up with a second augmentation. So again, you can see if you're not using that desalination plant all that much, where we end up quite often in a situation where we're going to actually be not only augmenting one thaggy, but actually thinking about building a second desalination plant. So the take-home messages, operational decisions are really important to augmentation occurrence. And that has a whole lot of cost implications, so the cost of maintaining reliability is dependent on that operation. Maintaining higher levels of storage give you a buffer. They reduce costs by reducing the likelihood of augmenting or delaying that augmentation, because we've got growing demand. Even if we can push augmentations back in time, that's got value to it. And it buys time to do other things. So good planning to shorten augmentation. Lead times also lowers costs, again by deferring augmentations. And I guess the last point I would make is we lived through the millennium drought. So it's the worst we've seen, but it's not necessarily the worst that's possible. And so we've got to always keep our mind open to what we would do in more dire situations. So I'll finish up there.
Great, thank you, Andrew. I'll just note that some enthusiastic souls are already on Slido, which is great. We'll hold over answering those questions until we get to the panel discussion. So just to let people know. So our next speaker, Professor John Thwaites, is the Chair of Melbourne Water. John's a professorial fellow at Monash University. He's the chair of the Monash Sustainable Development Institute, Climate Works Australia, and the Peter Cullen Water and Environment Trust. Thank you, John.
Thanks, Sharon. Can everyone hear clearly? Is that great? Well, I'd like to start by thanking University of Melbourne for hosting tonight. Sharon said this is about raising the quality of debate around key water issues, and that is a big task that we've got because water literacy is low. If you went out and asked in the street, if you asked people about the desal plant, most people would not know that it's being used. If you ask them about our water security system, most people have limited knowledge and very few understand the incredible water security challenge that we're facing with climate change. And that's sort of what I want to talk about tonight. But I do want to also congratulate Andrew and his team for their work, which Melbourne Water, which I chair, is using and adopting. And we've been working with you over the last few years, and it is very much influencing what we do. And I guess three key things that you've said tonight are influencing our strategy. First, the value of water in storage. It actually saves money for customers if we use the desal plant when we're above 60% and keep that water in storage. That is not the general community view, and I don't even think it's probably the view in many sectors of government who still see the desal plant as an insurance policy for the worst time in the drought. And what you've shown is that in fact we will save money if we use it when we've got more than 60%. The second thing that you highlight, which is a critical influence on policy, is to lower the augmentation lead time. And that means if we're going to have a further augmentation, and I'll show, and I absolutely believe we're going to need one, if we can lower the time from needing it to actually delivering it, we'll save money also. And that means planning for it now, not in a decade. And the third point that he made that I think is critical that we need to learn from is maintaining higher storage buys time for other demand and supply options. Now, the other demand and supply options are one around water conservation, and we need to be working on that straight away. I think we're going to hear more about that. But the other one is integrated water management and stormwater harvesting. What people don't understand, and this is a community literacy problem, including many of the proponents, is that is a very harvesting stormwater, while something we should be doing, is a very slow and incremental process. And people talk about the 350 gigalitres of stormwater that goes out into the bay every year as though we could just harvest that in one hit. I've been trying to do this for a decade now, and the best I can see is that we can get about 3 gigalitres a year cumulative. So that's 3 1 year, 6 after 2, 9 after 3. But the point is, if we put the desal water in the tank now, we've got more chance to build up that stormwater. And the one other point that you did make that I think is also critical is for the environment, because it's the desal plant and use of the desal water that buttresses our ability to provide sufficient water for the environment. I see people like John Langford and others, Barry Hart, who are back around these issues for decades. If you go back to the 68 drought and then I think 83, the Yarra took a huge hit because all the water came out of the river. So for all those reasons, thank you and congratulations. So I just want to briefly show you a few slides that we're wanting to communicate to the public to increase this water literacy. And the first one is this, which is the impact of population growth and water demand. And if you look at population, this is, because it's not just climate change, it's this incredible population growth. In the last decade, the time since I left as Water Minister, there are 1 million people more using Melbourne's water. That's that line up here. if you look at the total water use per head, that's this blue line, what you'll see is that that increased up until 2000 and then it came down substantially. Sorry, this is the green line. The green line here came down substantially. And the good news is that water use per head has not increased since the Millennium Drought. But the blue line, which is the total consumption, is now going up with population growth. And that's the story in a slide. That because we've got this huge population growth, we're seeing increase in demand for water, which is going to mean we need the desal plant and we need it now. But we've got another big challenge on the supply side. That's the demand side. And I think most of you have seen graphs like this. This is the inflows into Melbourne's reservoirs back since records were started in 1913. And what you see is that from 1913 through to 1997, the average inflow was 615 gigalitres. Since then, the average inflow is 416 gigalitres. That's a 35% reduction. That's exactly what happened in Perth. And the science tells us that it's linked to climate change. And it's a combination of cold fronts that we used to get not hitting us, together with higher temperatures, more evaporation, drier soils and less runoff. And we keep talking about the Millennium Drought as though that was something back then. Well, here's the Millennium Drought and here's the average of the last 5 years. We're in the Millennium Drought, we're still in it. And yet people don't realise that. And if you look at the result of that, this is our total water in storage. In broad summary, what we've seen in the last 5 years is that the amount of water in storage is coming down by 68 gigalitres per year. Now, what does it mean when you look at that supply and demand together? Because obviously they've got to match. And this graph is from Melbourne Water's system strategy from now to 2060. The blue line is supply, including full 150 gigalitre use of the desal plant. That's this blue line. The green line is what we project to be demand, and the dots are what's actually happening. Now, this of course is averages, and Andrew does much better modelling which looks at everything. But on averages, what we're looking at is by about 2029, even if we use all the desal water, 150 gigalitres a year, the demand will exceed supply. And another way to look at that, and this is a graph Alicia's seen lots of times, but this is really influencing our thinking at Melbourne Water, and I think the department's thinking. Because what this shows, here is demand for water going up. Here's supply, there's already a gap, which is going down. And the critical thing is that the gap is growing by about 14 gigalitres a year. Now, what's the implication for that for Andrew's work? The implication is that the ability to use the desal plant to recover storage and to slow down the need for next augmentation is reducing over time, because we're using more and more of the desal water just to supply the gap. And down the bottom here, the orange is using the desalination water to fill the gap. The orange to replenish the dams. That's the orange. And the blue is to fill the gap. And what you see, by about 2028, we run out of an ability to do that. And so the point of all of this is that when we look at our overall water security framework, we not only have to look at it in the terms that you've said, Andrew, that we have to keep, when we're above 60%, we have to keep using the desal plant. We have to be looking at that next to augmentation as well. And we make our desalinated water order on a number of principles, keeping the storages above the low zone and the medium zone, trying to recover, obviously minimising spills and looking at the effect on bills. But we have to do it all with the understanding that we're likely to need a new augmentation by around 2028, and we've got to be planning for that now.
Great, thanks, John. Our final speaker, Richard Smith, is the Manager of Business Planning and Regulation at City West Water. Richard's experience is in environmental economics, economic regulation, tariff design and water resource management. So thank you, Richard.
Thank you, Sharon. So I wanted to give you an overview of a retail perspective on some of the points that have been discussed tonight. So in what is a retailer, firstly? So as John's described the Melbourne Headwork system, the retailers are those corporations that take water from the Melbourne system and deliver it to end users and businesses and households across Melbourne. So we have that customer interface, we provide bills to customers, we have pricing, and we have a range of customer programs that try to increase water literacy and get water resource management on the agenda. We also work really closely, obviously, with Melbourne Water. We have a collaborative planning process. The infographic up here gives a little bit of a representation of the planning cycles we have. We have annual planning cycles. John's talked about the desalinated water order advice. We also have water outlooks, which talk to those actions we may need to take over the summer period. You'll remember restrictions as a feature of prior decades. We still look at whether those are appropriate. That's in our annual planning cycle. We also have 5-yearly planning cycles, which really are our opportunities to look at what is on the long-term horizon to take into consideration some of these features that Andrew and John are showing in their research, in their presentations. So the Melbourne Water System strategy and our urban water strategies are our tools to plan for that future. Under our really good water governance in Victoria, we also have, under the Water Act, long-term water resource assessments and sustainable water strategies, which really look to those big changes that we may need to consider collectively as a water sector. And so those processes run periodically every 10 years or so, and we participate actively in those to get the water infrastructure and water messaging that we need to manage our storages. So what's in our resource manager's toolkit? That is not my toolbox. And I think really what I'm going to talk to on this slide is the tools are quite well worn. We know what the tools are. John's talked about, in terms of the supply side, keeping a drought reserve storage, producing desalinated water, and of course optimising that water we can get from the catchments, albeit managing the environmental impacts of that. But on the demand side, where the retailers come in, we've got a host of programs to get water literacy front of mind for customers. We use our bills, we use other channels to get the education message out there. And a power of work was done during the Millennium Drought. We're still in it, as John said, but a lot of the programs you'll see there were really effective in reducing per capita water use, and we see that baseline in the per capita water use that John presented, but it is a constant effort to maintain that water literacy and keep the per capita water use stable where we see it, and decreasing if we can. There's also a middle piece here, things that are not necessarily strictly demand or supply, so those substitutable products. John talked about stormwater harvesting and recycled water. They are slow burns. We see that from our distribution networks, that these things set growth up. So it's only when the growth occurs in 10, 20, 30 years' time that we get the great yield from some of those systems. So we do see the need for short-term actions. And in terms of how Andrew's work comes in, so Andrew, I am an economist and I do think in marginal cost. So what we're doing in terms of positioning that portfolio of that toolbox of actions that we can take is thinking about the costs of the interventions we can take, how we would order them, how we would reprioritise them as storage level changes, and we're looking to things like the economic value of water in storage to inform where we position some of those things. I think one of the great things we've got in Victoria is a good, robust price regulation framework. So retail price signals have been a really important part of the water conservation story. We have a tiered pricing mechanism in place in Melbourne, and we do charge at long-run marginal costs. So these have been effective tools in getting water use to where we need it to be, and will continue to be that way into the future, particularly as desal orders come online and as future augmentations occur. So that was what I wanted to cover tonight. Thanks, Sharon.
Great. Thank you, Richard. Can I just test, is this microphone working? Great. So now we come to the exciting panel part of the evening. So I would like to invite the panellists to join up on the stools. Okay, so mixing it up, we're over here now. So to kick us off, I'm going to introduce the fourth member of our panel who hasn't yet spoken, Alida Donald, who has elected to take an innovative approach to presenting and just do a bit of Q&A with me. So we're mixing it up there. Thank you, Alida. So just by way of introduction, Alida is the Director of Water Resource Reform and Insights with the Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning. She has extensive expertise in water catchment and natural resources management across public, private and NGO sector. So thank you, Alida, for joining us. So just to get the ball rolling, and maybe I'm going to start with a couple of questions, but now's the time to encourage you all to, thank you, Liz.
Slido.
Embrace the technology. Log on to Slido, send through some questions. Oh, they are coming through, so that's great. But I'll take advantage of being chair for a moment and just hit Alida with a question or two. So in both Andrew and John's talk, we heard about Melbourne being, Andrew described the Melbourne System, which is part of the broader Water Victorian grid. John was talking about some of the supply and demand challenges we face. And I'm just wondering if you could tell us, how does the Victorian water grid contribute to water security?
Okay. Hello, everyone. And thank you to the three other panellists for being able to convey what is very complex stuff quite succinctly and amazingly on time. Well done. So the Victorian water grid is one of those concepts that means different things to different people. So that means I get to answer this as to my preference. And I think when we talk about the Melbourne system, obviously the grid is made up of what we are familiar with the systems that Andrew showed, with the dams. But we've been able to introduce rainfall-independent sources with the desal plant and our very chipping away, incremental approach to recycled water and a little bit of stormwater. But with a statewide hat on, the water grid actually is across the state. It does include things like modernising irrigation districts in order to recover water, to return to the environment. Also in the case of Northern Victoria, that returns water to Melbourne, who invested in that. That has opened up a lot of potential to be able to move water to where it is needed with the mechanism of markets. But we've also been able to, particularly for a little tiny town, so during the Millennium Drought, and John will know these figures, we had, we reached a top of 438 towns on restrictions. We are in the worst start to the year that we've had in many years. We've got Gippsland in its third year of drought. The lower bits of Barwon Waters area are, really struggling. And across Victoria at the moment, we've got 7 towns on restrictions. And a reason for that is the recognition that we need to use the grid to provide not just one source for these little tiny systems that are vulnerable to a climate that isn't what it was. It's not just going to stop here. We're not going to stop at, 38% decrease? We're pretty sure it's going to keep going. So the water grid is part of helping to provide that flexibility. But it is also not a magic pudding. It doesn't create new water outside of a desalination plant. The other thing I should say, and now I'm just blaring on, sorry, is urban users expect that we will continue to augment to meet their needs. That is not what we offer all of the irrigation users out there. So in northern Victoria, for example, and right across the state, they have a system that now has water recovery, and Victoria signed on to it to redress the balance with a significant amount of water being returned to the environment. At the same time that we are seeing these significant steps down, we are not augmenting, we are not providing more water. They are living with less water, and that is their future. So it's quite different across the state, and the grid is really important in helping people to have choices and flexibility.
Great. Thanks, Alida. Now they're coming thick and fast, so I think I'll turn to the Slido app. And we've got a couple of questions, or a few questions here, so I'll roll them together, and I think it's really one for John, and it's a question around, given what we've heard, it's a question about the potential use of recycled water as an augmentation. So would you like to speak to that?
Sure. So recycled water is one of the diverse sources of supply that we can consider and use. It's what you use it for and what it's fit for purpose for. So recycled water is currently used in a number of urban environments to replace potable water, for example, in irrigating gardens and in flushing toilets. What we haven't got agreement on, either from the health authorities or from the community, is to using recycled water for potable water, for drinking water. And there'll be lots of people who say we should do that. Frankly, politically, I wouldn't spend a whole lot of time invested in that, because the health and political and community issues, I think, are so great that we're going to just get a huge debate about that when we should be getting on and planning augmentations that we know work, which are desalination and also doing stormwater harvesting, which I think we can do and use that water more easily than we can recycle wastewater. So that's a short summary of what is a really politically charged issue.
Great, thanks, John, and hopefully that does justice to the multiple questions coming in. I've got another question that may be one for you, Richard. The question is, as the situation is quite serious, requiring another multi-billion-dollar desal plant within 10 years, why hasn't the price of water gone up?
So we have a two-part tariff here in Victoria. So the variable component of our water bills, the water usage price, the way we signal the value of water is a couple of ways. So the base set point, the tier 1 price as we call it, you'll know from your own water bills is set quite significantly higher than the values that Andrew was showing on his slides. So we do send some quite strong signals about the value of water on your water bill. And then we also have a tiered price. So the more you use, the more expensive it becomes per unit volume. So there are a couple of settings that we have built into our pricing framework. The price regulator, the Essential Services Commission, does ask us to reference long-run marginal cost when we're setting our prices, so that's a reference point we use, but we're also balancing customer affordability. You can imagine there's a number of households out there that don't have direct control over all of their water use. You can imagine some tenants who may be in dwellings that don't have the ability to control all the appliances or the water pipes in their tenancy. Large families, we have new migrants who have maybe 3 or 4 households under one roof, and so they're all exposed to the variable water price. It's something that we see as a balancing act in terms of how to get that signalling and fairness right.
Great, thank you. Another question coming in, and I think, John, it speaks to some of the points that you were making about water literacy. And it's a question that maybe the whole panel can consider, but it's how and when is water literacy important for water planning, and what can we do to improve it? It's just the simple questions.
Well, I think it's absolutely critical. And if you go back to the Millennium Drought, the government put an enormous amount of effort and investment into raising water literacy around the challenge of the drought and the need for water conservation. And we were able to reduce water use per head by around 40%, which is huge. But importantly, about a half of that was without restrictions. So we got to, I can remember, it was 22% below the previous decade's average before we had restrictions in 2006. And that was a big water literacy campaign, but it took money. I mean, there was a big investment, and we're not doing that now. We're hoping to do it on the cheap, and I don't think you can. But it's not just about water conservation. We need to raise people's understanding about stormwater harvesting, about desal water, and importantly, about the impact of their housing development on their local environment. So we're putting all these impermeable surfaces in, building these new McMansions and whatever that go right across the whole lot, and that's having a big impact on the environment and the health of streams. And I think we've got to do a lot of water literacy work on that.
As someone who invests in water literacy, there's a societal background to this, which is media and people love a crisis, and people aren't interested in engaging on water until there's a crisis. Secondly, the attention span, not of kids, but of every generation, is shrinking rapidly. So trying to get cut through and have sophisticated debates, engaging on difficult issues in all sorts of public policy areas is only getting harder. So we have to update how we engage with the public. And the third thing is trust in government is plummeting. And trust in government plummeting is an issue because that is the social licence that all of us here have to make decisions on the behalf of the community to manage water right. And so water literacy to me is treated as a term that's a little bit esoteric sometimes and a little bit just, key messages, like a comms thing. It's actually made up of a whole heap of underlying values and societal trends that we really have to tap into and be aware of. And that is really the challenge that we're really trying to cut through with that.
I'd just add one point to the transition we're seeing there is with the rise of e-billing and direct debit. So one of the channels that we use as retailers to provide messaging and water literacy information is our bills. So with direct debit and e-billing, that channel is being less effective in terms of its reach. So there's a lot of changes. We need to be smarter in how we engage with our customers, social media, other channels, even just in community at events is where we need to focus.
Could I just bring in Andrew? I'd like to urge Andrew, the work that you've done, I'm not expecting that to go out and be on Channel 9 or something, but economists and treasury types, how much are you getting through to them on this need to see the value of putting in the water in storage?
We've done a reasonable amount with that original report in terms of trying to push it around a whole lot of different people. It has been on the ABC a couple of times. But yeah, we can do more, and happy to contribute to sort of joint efforts in that. I was going to also make another point. I think that water literacy is really important, but there are also some other levers. We've seen pretty good effectiveness out of some things around the building code and that as well, with dual flush toilets, other water saving technology. So there's potentially other spots we can look as well to pull that per capita usage down.
I think that conversation really flags that the research community increasingly, I think, there's an expectation about how to improve our mechanisms and pathways for communicating the findings of research, and how we make sure that's done in a way that is accessible to people and meaningful in terms of translating to real world outcomes. And I think the fact that we're in a society where there's increasing distrust in science, not just government, and indeed facts. I think it really highlights we all have a role to play, whatever perspective we're participating in the sector, in terms of making sure we're communicating these issues effectively.
I think I agree that the trust in science, but I think what we know is that humans are storytellers, and where we see cut through is people who are really effective at weaving facts into a narrative and a story that has some hooks to people's lives, rather than rolling out the boffins to just present the facts, and we have no connection to your life. And that's a role of different people. So we still need, Andrew, I'm going to call you a boffin, to do the research, and then we all have different roles in different capacities, as do other people in the sector and who we partner with, to then make that come alive. So I still think that what we went through a period of being lazy, of rolling out scientists, is what I would say, and we need to get back to that storytelling with facts rather than that storytelling with fibs.
So, a question that came in while you were talking, Andrew, so I'll direct it to you, and I think coming out of the results of your work, the question was, does your study, does it mean that we should be using the north-south pipeline more?
Okay, so that's obviously a politically charged issue, or has been over the years since it was built, and that's why right at the moment it's got a trigger of 30% storage on it. It clearly is of value to use it more. It's another contribution to building that buffer. There is, I guess, some constraints around the system that need to be addressed in terms of exactly where the demands sit around Melbourne compared to the ability to supply from Sugarloaf Reservoir. But so, yes, it should be used more. Those constraints ought to be looked at in a bit more detail to work out whether or not they're real. There are various different people's opinions that I've heard in conversations to date. The other point I would make, though, is that we did build the opportunity cost of taking water out of the Goulburn in, and we based that on market prices in Goulburn. Now, if you go and talk to people in Northern Victoria at the moment, those market prices just keep going up and up and up. So that economic opportunity, if you think about it as what's your minimum cost way of doing things, is getting smaller and smaller over time. A little bit like the opportunity to fill in from the desal plant is getting smaller over time.
Can I just add something to this?
I think there's a great opportunity for you to do some more research because the current rule seems to me to be exactly the opposite of what we should have. So having a rule that you can only use the north-south pipe when Melbourne is below 30% means you're asking for water from the north at a time of extreme drought when the water would be at its highest value. And I would have thought the sort of analysis you could do would show that if you used the water when the dams were more than 80% or 90% full, you could afford to pay farmers double the market price then, or triple. They'd make money, and the water could then be put in storage for the future here and be worth something, and it would be a win-win. And your nice little graphs with blue and pink lines could show farmers that actually they'll make money if we change the rules.
Yeah, agreed with that. And so that's really use it when there's lots of water. There's another opportunity around that as well if you look more broadly across the state, and that is water for the environment and irrigation. There's an opportunity to use more water for the environment when it's wet, irrigation when it's dry. So trading back and forth between the various different sectors around the state and working out exactly what infrastructure is needed to enable those movements of water. I'm sure there's lots of opportunities around that.
I do have to say, on behalf of the environment, that we do know that with climate change, they are bearing the risks of climate change as well. It is not straightforward to say that the environment only needs water during wet periods. We have a whole mix of objectives, one of which is maintaining drought refuge during long and extended periods of dry. And I know you know this, Andrew. I just want to share that we get a lot of pressure. There's a lot of media at the moment. Why can't the environment just provide more water for irrigation? And it is not straightforward, and we have a lot of work that goes behind the optimal use of environmental water to ensure we are maintaining habitats and species over years and over extended dry periods, the likes of which they have not experienced prior to the type of climate change shift we are experiencing.
Yeah, thank you. One of the questions in some ways related to environment is around what are the energy and climate impacts of augmenting water supplies through using desalination?
Okay, I'll just say briefly to remind people that the current desalination plant does in fact have a big bank of solar panels. It's been very handy for us to be able to actually generate extra electricity and sell that back into the grid. That is part of what we're able to do there. The other thing that we know, which I'm not sure how, I'm sure Andrew, the Boffin, would have captured this, is that the use of energy associated with desalination has just plummeted with recent technology, and that is just continues to go down. So accounting for that in our future augmentations is undoubtedly going to be important. The other thing is that in using our alternative sources like recycled water and stormwater, fantastic for addressing, say with stormwater, the issue of all this water suddenly going into urban streams and ruining them, but they take a lot of energy as well. So desalination and use of those sources is, that we're talking about, we've done all of the gravity cheap energy options. All of the options are going to take a lot of energy, but the technology does continue to get more and more efficient, but you will know more.
Yeah, that's all true. The factoid that I like around this particular question is that if you take a litre of water and heat it up by about 3 or 4 degrees, you use the same amount of energy as desalinating a litre or getting a litre of water from desalinated seawater. So heating water is a very intensive use of energy in our water systems. Desalination has a reputation as being energy hungry, and to an extent that's true, but there's a lot of other opportunities to offset around our water system. So saving some water in the shower, it's all hot water.
Yeah, I think the figure's 90% of all the emissions from water come in the home, not in the water treatment.
And just add that each of the water corporations has a commitment on their climate pledges, so a pathway towards greenhouse neutral water, and any augmentation, whether it's stormwater, recycled water, future desal, the expectation would be that it fits in that same theme.
Great, thank you. Another question that you may all be interested in responding to from your different perspectives is the question of how willing is the sector to talk about risks to the water supply system?
Well, I think that is a good question, because I don't think the sector has been all that keen to talk about risks, and that's, because most organisations and governments are wary about raising a risk, because it does make you politically vulnerable. But I think we're at the stage where we have to have that open discussion with the community about the true impacts of climate change and population growth. If we've had a 35% reduction in water flow in Melbourne, and that's based on temperature rise of 1 degree, what's it going to be like at 2 and 3 degrees? And for Melbourne, probably not too serious, because you can do desal. For the Murray-Darling Basin, it's an existential question.
I'm a bit conflicted with this, because I hear the reverse, which is the water sector is so risk averse as a culture. So it's this really interesting dichotomy of this reputation of being risk adverse in a cultural sense, and yet not discussing risk enough with the community. So it's just a dichotomy. The other thing is we possibly don't talk enough about emerging risks. So with another hat on, looking after water markets, cybersecurity is a major risk that we deal with daily, and that is going to be something that is more and more important across organisations, but also then extending into homes. Around all basic services.
Okay, so we've got a few questions that I'm going to kind of blend together here with this one. So there's a few questions around considering other sources of water, like increased efficiency of irrigation and groundwater as other sources for potential supply. And I'm just wondering whether Andrew, you want to talk about that in terms of other options, or if any other panel members want to reflect on those issues in terms of mechanisms to increase security of supply, so groundwater, irrigation, changing the balance.
Can start with one project we're working on at City West Water, which is an aquifer storage and recovery scheme that we've got going in Werribee. It's on land owned by Melbourne Water, and what we are doing there is it's part of our recycled water development in the West Werribee area, And what we're looking to do is inject high quality recycled water underground into an aquifer, we call it a bubble of water that can then be extracted at later times, at later years, to supply recycled water into the growing suburbs of the outer west. One of the challenges there, Sharon, is that it is a salty aquifer. The background salinity, so the aquifer is not suitable for drinking water, but we can use it in this innovative way to build essentially an underground tank of sorts for recycled water. So we're looking for innovative ways to increase security of supply, in that case on the recycled water side.
I can see some people in the audience who can talk about irrigation efficiency much better than I could, but I think I mentioned earlier that we consider that part of the grid that irrigators will have to have a future where we are not giving them more water. We're not doing desal plants for that. So they are already, like the massive shifts over 20 years of, there was flood irrigation everywhere. That's now kind of a relic. It has moved to far more efficient methods. And that's just going to continue to happen. We now have, when you go and visit the leading edge of what's happening in irrigation, you've got drippers on orchards that are tuned into the BOM weather outlooks, and that it is minute by minute. They have probes down into the root, how much they need. This is making our efforts at water use around my home look pathetic. But those types of efficiencies, where it is private money, they are doing that to then gain that water back to make it go further. Where we put public money in, we then return that water for public benefits, which has primarily been to redress this imbalance of water for the environment. So we have invested in efficiencies, say with leaky channels, in order to return that to the environment. We do not use public money for private benefit.
Great, thank you. We are pretty much out of time, and at the risk of not wanting to go over time. So I might actually just turn to the panellists and invite you, rather than heading off on another question. If anyone has got any closing reflections or key points that you'd like to make that you'd be keen for the audience to take away from today.
Get your planning done.
Being a politician, you always repeat yourself, so I'll do that. And emphasise we do have a burning platform out there, and it's caused by climate change with population growth. It does mean we've got a huge water security challenge, and a key part of meeting that challenge, I think, is having the sort of good data and research that you've provided us with tonight.
Great, thank you. Well, I think we're out of time now for any more questions. So I'd like to thank our panellists for participating in our discussion this evening, and a big thank you for the presentations. I think a really exciting opportunity to hear and see what the key issues are, get into some data. I think Boff and Andrew, I'm sure we're all nerds here. Really great to be able to engage both from the range, from the research side of things, right through to hearing from the actual practitioners who are working on the ground and dealing with these issues on a day-to-day basis, from a water cooperation perspective and through to the policy agenda. So a very big thank you to you all for participating. I think it's been really great. So could I ask everyone to thank our panellists?